The bodies and graves of Nazi leaders have been the subject of controversy, mystery, and suspicion, primarily due to the way their remains were handled after their death and the conspiracy theories that arose regarding their fate. Just take a look at the case of the very Chancellor of Germany. After taking his life in the Führer bunker, he and his wife, Eva Braun, had their bodies taken to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, where they were burned to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Shortly thereafter, the Soviets entered Berlin and recovered the charred remains, which initiated a series of transfers and concealments. Finally, in 1970, Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB, ordered their exhumation, cremation, and dispersion in the Biederitz River to prevent the remains from becoming a symbol for neo-Nazis. Only fragments of the jawbone and part of the skull were preserved, which were later analyzed and confirmed to be Hitler's, reinforcing the official version of his death. However, Soviet secrecy fueled conspiracy theories claiming that Hitler might have escaped, keeping the speculation about his final fate alive. In contrast, Karl Donitz, Hitler's successor at the head of the Third Reich, met a different fate. After the German defeat, he was captured and tried at the Nuremberg trials, where he received a 10-year prison sentence. He served his sentence and was released, spending the rest of his life in West Germany, where he died in 1980. Unlike Hitler, Donitz left no theories or mysteries surrounding his grave. His burial was conventional and free of controversy. The remains of both characters reflect the opposing fates of the leaders of the Third Reich and the echoes of a regime whose history still raises questions and theories. Yet they are not the only striking cases. In 2019, 80 years after the Second World War began in Europe, a page of Nazi history was reopened in Berlin. City police authorities reported that the grave of one of the most feared Nazi officers had been desecrated. The grave of Reinhard Heydrich, a man known for his relentless persecution of enemies of the Third Reich, had been the target of an attempted intrusion. The man was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands during the war and chaired the conference where the final solution was outlined. His reputation left no doubt about his role in the Nazi extermination machine, being a man who coldly implemented laws and measures of persecution without showing any sign of compassion. Since his assassination in 1942, it was known where he was buried, although his marker was removed over time. With all this, questions arose about what motivated the desecrators to attempt to break open his tomb in 2019. Among the prevailing theories, one relates to the possibility that they were looking for some historically valuable object. Heydrich was buried, it is believed, in his SS uniform, and it is thought that he might have been buried with high-ranking artifacts, which today would fetch millions in the collector's market. One of these sought-after items could have been his ceremonial sword, which might have been placed with him in his grave. But the mystery remains. What really happened to that sword? His reputation earned him the nickname the Blonde Beast. For Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, he represented the ideal of an Aryan man, which facilitated his rise to head of the Reich Main Security Office. From this position, he supervised the Gestapo, the security service, and the criminal police. His authority within the Nazi regime was immense, and he was eventually appointed protector of Bohemia and Moravia. In this role, he was tasked with subjugating the Czech population, as these regions were vital to the German arms industry. To maintain control, Heydrich instituted a regime of terror in which public executions were carried out, bodies were hung from posts, and those who defied the regime disappeared. For him, any act of resistance meant a death sentence, and his main goal was to maintain productivity in the region. However, the resistance movement grew, and it was with the training of British agents that the assassination attempt on his life was carried out in Prague in 1942. In an ambush, agents Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis attacked the convertible in which the protector was traveling, throwing a bomb that caused him serious injuries. Despite trying to resist, the man attacked succumbed to his wounds days later, due to a sepsis infection and blood poisoning, which seemed suspicious as he initially appeared to be recovering. After a final visit from Himmler, Heydrich fell into a coma, dying on the 4th of June 1942. At 38 years old, the deceased Nazi had a series of funeral ceremonies. The first was held in Prague, the city where he was killed. Then his body was transported to Berlin in a coffin, where a grand state funeral took place full of Nazi pomp and solemnity. Adolf Hitler himself attended the ceremony, while Himmler delivered an extensive eulogy in honor of his memory and legacy. The coffin, covered by huge flags with the swastika, was carried by high-ranking members of the SS, surrounded by flowers and the organization's insignia. Hitler played a key role in the event, personally placing the highest decorations, such as the German Order and the Blood Medal, on the funeral pillow. The SS leader concluded the ceremony with a speech in which he declared that it was a sacred duty to avenge his death and continue his tasks, ensuring the relentless destruction of the enemies of the German people. Subsequently, Heydrich's body was taken to the Invalidenfriedhof military cemetery in Berlin, a place where German army heroes and veterans rested. His grave was located in Section A of the cemetery, near a wall to the north and at the front of the place. Despite the magnitude of his funeral, his tomb was not completed as Hitler had imagined, as circumstances turned against the Nazi regime, and the monumental construction of his tomb remained unfinished. After some time, the marker on his tomb was removed and destroyed. In the decades following the war, the graves of prominent Nazi figures were subject to disturbances, exhumations, and controversies. Rudolf Hess, for example, was exhumed and cremated years after his death to prevent neo-Nazi activity at the site. But in the case of the deceased protector of Bohemia and Moravia, this never happened. His remains remained in the Berlin cemetery, and over time the tomb was left as it was. Well, in December of 2019, under the cover of darkness, someone attempted to open his grave. It was a local town hall employee who discovered the attempted desecration. No clear motive was found, and it was not confirmed that any remains had disappeared. On the other hand, the fact that no bones were removed from the tomb leads one to think that the desecrators were probably looking for something specific. It is speculated that Heydrich was buried with his full SS uniform, which possibly included some of his decorations. In life, he was known to take great care in his appearance and was rarely seen without his uniform, especially at official events. One of the possessions that might have been buried with him could have been his ceremonial sword, the Ehrendegen Reichsführer SS, a weapon used in ceremonies that, despite being decorative, represented a deep connection with the Nazi hierarchy. Designed by the SS high-ranking art advisor, the Degen was a symbol awarded to SS officers in recognition of special merits. It consisted of a thin, straight blade of varying length and a handle decorated with the SS lightning bolts. These types of swords were given at events and official ceremonies, and there are numerous photographs of Reinhard with the Degen by his side. It is possible that those who tried to desecrate the tomb were looking for this sword, as in the black market, an object like this, linked to such a high-ranking Nazi, could make a person a millionaire. The SS burial ritual included specific customs, such as burying the deceased officer with his sword. However, in some cases, the sword buried was not the officer's own, but rather someone close in rank or friendship, who would exchange their own sword as a sign of loyalty. In Heydrich's case, this gesture might have been made by someone close to Himmler or even Müller, head of the Gestapo. If this was the case, then a different sword might lie in his tomb, perhaps one belonging to one of those two Nazi leaders who shared a mutual respect with him within the Nazi hierarchy. However, considering what happened, the thieves did not manage to take anything, which suggests that the remains were examined to confirm this information. Thus, the attempted desecration became widely known. From loyalty to paranoia, the solitude and oblivion of Rudolf Hess. After the Second World War, Rudolf Hess, once one of Adolf Hitler's closest and most loyal men, spent the last years of his life in prison. He was imprisoned in Spandau, where he would serve a life sentence for war crimes and crimes against peace. After the war, many of the Nazi leaders who shared the prison with him were eventually released, but he, an enigmatic and uncomfortable figure, was kept in confinement. Over time, Spandau became his final resting place, and physical and mental deterioration was inevitable over the years. Rudolf's life in prison was austere. The elderly man, over 90 years old, lived under constant supervision by guards of different nationalities who watched him closely and limited his contact with the outside world. For decades, he was only allowed a small amount of paper to write letters to his family. and his interactions with other prisoners were strictly controlled. Hess's days were spent with simple activities, such as walks in the prison gardens, which offered a relief amid his isolation. However, these moments of freedom also reflected the solitude that accompanied him and the weight of history on his shoulders. Despite the apparent peace of his life in prison, he never abandoned the paranoia that characterized him. During the nights he would cry and scream, accusing the guards of poisoning his food. On several occasions, he tried to leave this world early, including one attempt in 1945 when he buried a bread knife. This man remained faithful to his beliefs and never apologized for his actions or his role in the Nazi regime. Finally, on the 17th of August, 1987, he was found dead in the summer pavilion of the prison gardens. His body lay with an electrical cord around his neck, presumably in a final desperate act on his part. Despite the official cause that was presented, this version was the subject of controversy and conspiracy theories, as many doubted that a 93-year-old man could have planned and executed this act on his own. Shortly after his death, authorities ordered the demolition of Spandau prison, thus eliminating the place that had been his home and tomb in life for over 40 years. His body was buried in a cemetery in the town of Wunsiedel in Bavaria, where his parents' remains also rested and where he had spent holidays in his youth. The burial was carried out without much publicity, with the intention of keeping the place discreet. However, the site soon attracted the attention of far-right groups, who began making pilgrimages and tributes to Hess's grave. Nazi supporters saw him as a martyr, and every year, on the anniversary of his death, neo-Nazi groups gathered around his grave, decorating it with wreaths and forbidden symbols such as swastikas, and performing the typical Nazi salute. Faced with the growing problem these gatherings represented and the fame the place was gaining, the German authorities decided to intervene. Less than a year after his burial, on the 17th of March 1988, the remains of the Nazi were discreetly exhumed in a nighttime operation and later relocated to a cemetery with less public access, hoping that this move would reduce attention on his figure. Despite these measures, the new burial site was quickly discovered by sympathizers of extremist ideologies who continued using his grave as a gathering point. Over time, the fervor surrounding Hess's figure and the veneration of his grave continued to escalate. The neo-Nazi gatherings generated growing tension in the town, where the inhabitants felt overwhelmed by the number of visitors who arrived every year to pay homage to a man whose memory they themselves preferred to forget. The Nazi symbols and the salutes made at the site became an affront to the community's peace, and social pressure began to grow, reaching an unsustainable point. Eventually, the Wunsiedel town hall decided not to renew the grave contract when the usage permit expired. His descendants, especially his granddaughter, vehemently opposed this decision, arguing that their grandfather's wish had been to be buried in that specific place alongside his family. But given the situation, the community considered that the activities at his grave had become intolerable and a potential danger. Finally, on the night of the 20th of July, 2011, in a carefully planned operation and under complete silence, Rudolf Hess's remains were exhumed for the second and final time. This time, the decision was final. His body was taken to a nearby crematorium where his remains were incinerated. The ashes were given to the family and, following official instructions, were scattered at sea, eliminating any possibility that a physical site would remain a reference point for his followers. His gravestone, which carried the inscription, "I dared," was destroyed, and all elements referring to the man who had been Hitler's deputy were removed. In Wunsiedel, the community finally breathed a sigh of relief. For many, the problem had been solved. The decision to cremate and scatter the ashes of the former deputy at sea eliminated any tangible trace of his grave, and with it, an attempt was made to eradicate the symbolism associated with his figure. Although his remains no longer exist on Earth, his figure remains an enigma for historians and a subject of reflection on loyalty, fanaticism, and the consequences of a regime like the one he helped sustain. Beyond the trial, the enigma of Himmler's grave. In the post-Second World War trials, numerous members of the SS and high-ranking Nazi officials were brought to justice for their crimes. As mentioned earlier, among those absent from these trials was Adolf Hitler, who, before allowing himself to be captured, decided to end his life in the Führerbunker in Berlin. However, one of the most powerful names of the Third Reich who never faced a tribunal was Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, the organization responsible for the security and repression of the Nazi regime, as well as for overseeing the concentration camps. It was rumored that many SS officers felt more loyalty to him than to the Chancellor himself, which made him a double-edged figure for the Führer, but that loyal servant would not know justice in life. Like Hitler, he chose his own end, thus escaping any formal condemnation. On the 23rd of May, 1945, the leader of the SS died under British custody. He was on the run, without allies or friends, as the Allied forces gained ground in Europe and the Nazi regime crumbled to pieces, defeated. Hitler had ordered his arrest, and the government that emerged after his death also wanted nothing to do with him. Aware that the Allied powers were also searching for him, Heinrich decided to hide. He traveled with a few companions, avoiding towns and cities under Allied control, until near Bremerwörde he was captured. To avoid being identified, he gave a false name, Heinrich Hitzinger. However, at the internment camp, despite the disguise he wore, he was recognized and revealed his true identity. The British could not believe they had Himmler in their custody. In his possession, they found 2 brass capsules. One contained cyanide and the other was empty. Upon this revelation, an exhaustive search was ordered, and he was transferred to the headquarters of the 2nd British Army in Lüneburg for further inspection. It was there that he, with a final, desperate move, did what he felt he had to do with one of those capsules. In 15 minutes, he died. The frustration among the British was immense. They had had the most important war criminal within the Nazi hierarchy in their hands, and contrary to expectations, he had escaped his trial. Had he been subjected to a tribunal, he would have surely been executed, and his knowledge of the internal workings of the Nazi Party and the SS could have shed more light on the structure and functioning of the regime. Soon after his death, 2 death masks of his face were made. One was sent to General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces and future President of the United States, while the other was kept secret as the doctor who made it decided to make an additional copy. The mask showed an almost mocking face, an impactful image considering the crimes he had committed during the war. Rumors about the fate of Himmler's body began shortly after his autopsy, in which the features of a well-nourished adult man of average build were detailed, with no particular facial features except for a slight deviation in the nasal septum. His brain was removed, presumably to be studied to understand the mind of a man who, for the Allies, was so associated with evil. However, beyond this, the body was handed over to the British forces for burial, starting a chain of speculations about its final fate. To this day, the exact burial site of his remains remains shrouded in mystery. It is believed that he was buried in a wooded area near the site of his death, in the surroundings of Lüneburg Heath, a large forested area in Lower Saxony. The soldiers tasked with the burial made sure the grave left no visible signs, thus avoiding any attempts to turn it into a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazi sympathizers. Simply, no gravestone or sign was placed. Lüneburg Heath, a vast and dense forest, would become his final home, thus making it difficult to locate his grave in the following decades. But theories about the fate of his remains don't end there. It is speculated that a few months after his burial, his body was exhumed by the British forces for a second autopsy. This second post-mortem examination, whose results remain classified, was carried out to verify if it was indeed the former SS head who had died under those circumstances. This exhumation further fueled doubts and rumors about the fate of his remains. One of the most striking theories suggests that, after this second autopsy, Himmler's body was taken to a nearby concentration camp. In a kind of poetic justice, his remains would have been cremated in the same type of oven where thousands of innocent people had been cremated. This version, although not officially confirmed, would have been a symbolic way of giving the SS leader the same fate many suffered under his command. With all this, the story does not end there. The information regarding his last moments and the exact location of his burial remains classified in British archives, which will not be accessible to the public for several decades. This has allowed speculations to continue, and the question of the whereabouts of his remains persists to this day. Some believe that, after the exhumation, the body was secretly returned to his grave in Lüneburg Heath, where it would remain hidden beneath the dense foliage. Others claim that after the post-mortem examinations, Heydrich's remains may have been moved to another unknown location, further adding to the mystery of his final fate. Today, it remains possible that decades later, Heinrich Himmler's remains still lie beneath the earth somewhere in Germany, hidden among the vegetation and the silence of the forest, while the archives that hold the truth remain sealed. Brazil. As the final refuge, the angel of death and his curious destiny, Josef Mengele died on the 7th of February 1979 while visiting the Brazilian coast of Bertioga. That day, after a life marked by fear of being captured, he had decided to go for a swim. His health had deteriorated over time, and he suffered from high blood pressure and had a heart attack just 3 years earlier. During this last swim, the doctor suffered a heart attack that left him incapacitated in the sea, unable to stay afloat until he was rescued. Death by drowning became inevitable, and he died at the age of 67. Over the years, he had used a series of aliases to evade justice and remain hidden. Finally, at the Embu das Artes cemetery in Brazil, he was buried under the false name of Wolfgang Gerhard. His grave was modest, without inscriptions revealing his past political affiliations or true identity, and only those close to him knew the truth behind that gravestone which hid one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals in history. For years, his remains stayed at that place, and it was uncertain if the man buried there was indeed the infamous Angel of Death. Interest in him and his whereabouts did not fade over the years. His absence from the Nuremberg trials, where other Nazi doctors were judged, only contributed to the mystery and theories about his whereabouts. He had been one of the most wanted men after the Second World War due to his involvement in sadistic medical experiments at the Auschwitz concentration camp. However, fate had avoided him facing justice in life, so various organizations and governments continued to pursue him, hoping to confirm his death or, better yet, bring him before a court. The mystery surrounding his whereabouts stretched for decades. It wasn't until May of 1985 that a significant breakthrough in the investigation occurred. That month, the house of one of Mengele's friends, Hans Sedlmayr, was raided. During the search, authorities found a coded address book and letters exchanged between the two. These documents revealed that Sedlmayr had been notified of the Angel of Death's death while swimming. It was from this evidence that the exact location of Wolfgang Gerhard's tomb in Brazil was obtained. The authorities decided to exhume the remains on the 6th of June 1985, with the purpose of verifying if the corpse indeed belonged to the person they were searching for. When the tomb was opened, the remains were recovered, and a thorough series of forensic exams began. Verifying the identity of the body was complex, as Mengele's previous medical records were limited. There were no X-rays, and fingerprint comparisons were not possible due to the advanced state of decomposition of the skin on his fingers. Despite this, U.S. scientists were able to confirm that the skeleton belonged to a Caucasian man of similar age and stature to the remains they were seeking. Additionally, the structure of the skull matched the physical characteristics of the Nazi doctor, especially a prominent frontal arch and a noticeable space between the front teeth, distinctive traits that he had. A detailed analysis of the skeleton revealed a hip fracture. This injury was consistent with a motorcycle accident he had suffered during his stay at Auschwitz, further supporting the hypothesis that the body found in the grave was his. Furthermore, investigators found evidence that the skeleton showed signs of osteomyelitis, a bone infection, and a deformity in the right leg, which caused his left leg to be 1.5 centimeters longer than the right, affecting his gait. A hole in the cheekbone also caught the attention of forensic experts. Although some speculated that the hole might have originated after death due to wear from the tomb's environment, other specialists noted that it could be a result of chronic sinus infections, which Mengele apparently suffered from. In fact, historical photographs of him show a slight mark on the left side of his face, and in some letters he had mentioned recurrent facial pain. Another relevant finding was a fracture in the shoulder of the skeleton, although forensic experts could not determine precisely when this injury occurred. However, in his writings, there had been complaints of severe pain in the shoulder, which further strengthened the identification of the body.